My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Old Testament prophets and kings, and scheming scoundrels too, collected in this book, Exile of the Chosen, God's Heroes from Solomon to Malachi. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended. Chapter 3, Part 1, Jedediah.
"You may now take a break," the boy's teacher said.
Jedediah stretched and took a deep breath.
"I don't know why we have to learn all this boring historical stuff," Ahaziah complained.
"Well," Jedediah laughed, "I understand why you have to learn it. You're the son of a king, the crown prince. Someday you'll be king."
"When I'm king, I'm going to be like my father Ahab, and will have a really good man in charge of all my business and the palace. I'll have a steward of the royal houses, lands and possessions, so that I can spend my time enjoying being king. That's why you should study this stuff. When we grow up and I'm king, I'll make you prime minister, and you can do all the work and I will do the playing. We'll be a perfect team."
"It doesn't work exactly that way," Jedediah said carefully.
"Of course it does," Prince Ahaziah insisted. "I see it every day."
Jedediah was quiet. As the prince's best friend, he had learned there were times when it didn't pay to argue with Ahaziah. The boy's father had also taught him that there were times when it was best to be silent around royalty. Even though they lived in the land of Israel, a country that God had separated from Judah, it wasn't safe to be too enthusiastic about worshiping God in the ways of Judah. It hadn't been for some time, but especially now. King Ahab had married Princess Jezebel, the daughter of King Ethbaal. Ethbaal was king of Tyre, a center of Baal worship. Jezebel came to Israel with the primary goal of converting the country to Baal worship, and she had been fairly successful. Jedediah's father, Obadiah, top minister in Ahab's administration, had taught him that they should keep silent outside their home and only worship the God of Israel in secret. The boy knew that his father did several things for the God of Israel that Ahab would find upsetting and Jezebel would be furious over. Thus now he did not say anything to Ahaziah.
"So what shall we do this afternoon?" the king's son asked. "We've done everything interesting that I can think of."
"I don't know. Do you want to go riding?"
"No, we've been on all the good trails around here. Everything's boring."
Their teacher strode back into the room.
"Boys, don't make too many plans for this afternoon. We've been discussing the laws of Israel, and I would like you to come and sit in the king's court this afternoon and watch how he settles disputes."
"Oh, no," Ahaziah groaned.
Jedediah chuckled. "Oh, you didn't want to go horseback riding anyway."
"But to just sit there and listen to Father all afternoon, he's not exactly Solomon, you know."
Jedediah decided this was another good time to stay quiet.
"Someday, Ahaziah," the teacher interrupted, "you are going to have to settle disputes in this court, and it would behoove you to learn a little bit about the laws and how they apply. You don't want to be known as one who had no wisdom or justice."
Ahaziah shrugged. Jedediah wondered whether the prince really cared about anything. But it didn't matter anyway. They were going to spend the afternoon in Ahab's court.
"Now go get some lunch, because I want you in the courtroom when the king is ready to start."
"Yes, sir," the boy said, and headed for the dining area. In the courtroom, King Ahab of the nation of Israel sat on his carved ivory throne. Prince Ahaziah sat on a smaller throne at his side. Obadiah stood on the right of Ahab's throne, and Jedediah next to his father. It was an honor to be allowed to stand so close to the throne. Most people had to remain much further away or could not enter the courtroom at all. Being the son of the second most important man in Israel, and best friend of the crown prince, did have its advantages. People came and went. Some of the cases were interesting, but many of them seemed to Jedediah to be petty complaints about injustices that could have been settled a different way if people weren't so selfish. Ahaziah slouched in his chair and tried not to yawn. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance of the courtroom. An odd-looking man burst in without invitation or announcement, and before the soldiers could stop him, took a position directly before the king. Jedediah stared. No one just entered the courtroom without invitation or announcement, and no one approached the throne without kneeling totally prostrate with their faces clear to the floor for the king's blessing before they stood. The boy glanced at his father. Obadiah stood motionless, but the muscles in his jaw were tight, and a little spot on his cheek twitched like it did when he was worried about something. Ahab glowered like a thundercloud and roared,
"What are you doing in my courtroom? And how dare you enter this way?"
The strange man lowered his gaze to make eye contact with Ahab. He didn't flinch or blink, but answered the king coolly and directly.
"I am Elijah, the Tishbite. I serve the Lord. He's the God of Israel. You can be sure that he lives. And you can be just as sure that there will be not any dew or rain on this entire land. None will fall during the next 2 years, nor will it start again until I say so."
A hush fell over the courtroom. For a moment no one knew what to say. Elijah turned on his heel and strode out as unexpectedly as he had appeared. As he disappeared, Ahab exploded.
"How dare he come into my courtroom like this? How dare he threaten me? How dare he think he can decide who the God of Israel is? I'm the king. Doesn't he know that?"
The courtroom broke into a buzz of discussion.
"Well, what are you doing just standing there?" the king shouted. "Get him! Kill him!"
The soldiers rushed out of the courtroom. Ahab sat for a moment, waiting for them to return with the prophet. When nothing happened, it became embarrassing. He threw the scroll he had been holding on the floor and stumped out of the chamber. Ahaziah and Jedediah left by a different exit. They hurried to their favorite place on the rooftop of the palace, where they could sit and dangle their legs and talk privately without anyone hearing them.
"What was that all about?" Ahaziah demanded. "I couldn't believe that guy just marched in there. And what was he wearing?"
"I think that was camel's hair," Jedediah replied. "It certainly doesn't look comfortable."
"Well," Ahaziah commented, "if he wasn't so rude to rich people, perhaps he would be able to afford something better than that."
Jedediah smiled. Probably so. Those who kept their mouths shut did fairly well in Israel, but he couldn't help feeling a secret admiration for the oddly dressed man.
"So what's the deal with no rain?" Ahaziah continued. "Baal is the god of rain." And he broke into a chuckle. "Oh, I get it. The God of Israel wants to take Baal on at his own game in his own territory."
"That's what it sounded like to me," Jedediah said cautiously. "Although the God of Israel probably considers Israel his own territory."
"Well, it used to be," Ahaziah muttered. "He's just a sore loser."
Again Jedediah remained silent.
"This should be interesting," Ahaziah mused. "Do you think the God of Israel really can shut up the heavens? He might be able to for a month or two, but the rainy season is coming. Maybe he will announce that it's okay to rain before that happens." And he laughed at his own joke.
"I wonder if your father's soldiers will find him," Jedediah said.
"Of course, then they'll kill him, and it will never ever rain again because he said it couldn't happen until he said so."
Jedediah smiled. Maybe they should keep him alive at least until he gives permission for it to rain again.
"Nah, the guy's crazy."
"You really think so?" Jedediah asked.
"Sure, who else would come into the royal court like that? He's a goner."
"We have a good view from up here," Jedediah commented. "That way we can watch the soldiers searching for him. I haven't seen him dragging anybody back yet."
"No, not yet,"
Ahaziah agreed. Although Jedediah nodded, secretly he hoped that they wouldn't find the prophet Elijah, or if they did, that God would keep them from hurting him too much. He couldn't help admiring the man. Later, the two boys resumed their lessons.
"Any questions?"
their teacher asked when he had finished. "Yes," Jedediah said. Ahaziah rolled his eyes.
"In Sidon, do they worship Baal too?"
The teacher nodded. "Yet they tolerate people of other religions and those who worship other gods. Why do we kill the prophets of the previous God of Israel?"
"That's a very good question. As you know, the worshippers of Baal are kind and benevolent people, and historically they have been very tolerant of others and any god they choose to worship. Although it is foolish to worship anyone other than Baal if one hopes for fertility in the land and prosperity in the cities. The decision to kill the prophets of the God of Israel is more one of politics.
Why? Jedediah persisted.
Well, as you know, Israel has been a theocracy, or it was supposed to be, before it became a monarchy with kings, and its people only worship the God of Israel. He was always so exclusive about it, forbidding the people to worship anybody else. Hardly a tolerant religion, their teacher commented, rolling his eyes. Therefore, though the worshippers of Baal are tolerant and benevolent, the previous God of Israel insists on being the only one. For Baal worship to become the official worship in the country, rather than the worship of that God, one would have to wipe out those who would preach against it. And certainly over the years there have been some who have been very vocal against Baal. But that is treasonous, since both our king and queen are avid worshippers of Baal, and our queen is the highest priestess in the land.
Jedediah knew that was true. Ahaziah sat up straighter and stuck his chest out. He looked very proud.
Therefore, the only way to silence the opposition and get them to behave in a more tolerant manner was to kill them, their teacher concluded.
Ahaziah burst out laughing.
Yep, dead prophets of God are much more tolerant than live ones.
It was true. Jedediah had to agree silently to himself. Take Elijah, for example. The boy could never imagine the prophet being tolerant and allowing Baal worship. It made his stomach twist a little, though, as he thought about his father. Best not to even think such things when around other people, and he steeled his mind away from the topic. Both guardians assigned to Jedediah stood between him and his teacher, so the teacher could not read the look on the boy's face. It had only been a few nights before that he had made a disturbing discovery. His father Obadiah was governor of the palace and country, and so frequently had to leave on business. However, he usually traveled with a retinue of servants, scribes, and assistants. 2 nights ago, he had pulled on a dark-colored servant's cloak that veiled his face and slipped out through the kitchen courtyard. Jedediah was curious. What could father be doing? The boy followed at a distance so that Obadiah would not discover him and send him back to bed. As his father hiked on and on, Jedediah wondered whether they would ever get to where he was going, and several times the boy considered turning back. It was bad enough on the main roads and then the trails leading up to the rocky hills, but when his father left the paths completely, Jedediah began to worry he might not keep up with him and would get lost. His father climbed up the rocky wadi, then he disappeared. Panic-stricken, Jedediah called his name, but it bounced off the rocks in the darkness and echoed again and again. He scrambled up to the point where his father had been standing when he had seen him last. "Father!" he shouted. "Father, it's Jedediah! Where are you?" Suddenly, strong arms grabbed him and clamped a hand over his mouth. Kicking and trying to scream, the boy felt himself dragged into a cave. Then someone lit a torch and held it over his head. "It is my son. Let him go," he heard his father say. Whoever was holding him now let go, and Jedediah crumpled to the floor. "Father," he said as he looked up. Obadiah knelt beside him. "Jedediah, are you all right? What are you doing out here? Do you know how far from home you are?" His son broke into sobs. He considered himself almost a man, but even men get pushed to a breaking point sometimes. Finally, his sobbing hiccuped to a stop as he became aware of all the men standing around him. "I followed you," he said. "I was curious as to where you were going." Some of the men glanced down nervously.
"Did anyone else follow him?"
"Has he given away our hiding place?"
"No," Jedediah said. "Just me." His father ruffled his hair. "You have the makings of a great spy, Jedediah. Why did you follow me out here?" "I just wanted to see where you were going." "I guess it's time I told you, but this is a secret you must keep. We'll all lose our lives if you don't." Jedediah nodded solemnly. "These are some of the prophets of the God of Israel." The boy glanced around. "I thought all the prophets of the true God were dead. Didn't Queen Jezebel order their execution? That's why everyone was so surprised to see Elijah." Father smiled grimly. "She especially was surprised to see him, and Jezebel did make a law that all the prophets should be killed. However, some of them are hiding here." "But there are so many," the boy exclaimed, glancing around. "Yes, about 50 of them. There are 50 here, and 50 in another cave further down the wadi." 100? Father, how can 100 men survive hiding in caves? Who's been feeding them? Someone would have to be organizing all of that. Suddenly a look of understanding crossed Jedediah's face. You're taking care of them. Yes, I rarely come out here. I make arrangements, though, and God's people will survive and be fed until such a time as things are safer. I don't know what the God of Israel plans to do, but whatever it is, I'm sure he will need some prophets to straighten out the mess this country is in when it is ready to worship him again. Many of the men surrounding him nodded. I should never have followed you, Jedediah confessed, but I promise I'll never let your secret out. It will mean the end of our lives if you do, his father said. The boy knew that it was common when someone was executed for treason that his entire family was killed along with him. I will not tell, he repeated, standing and drawing himself up to his full height. I, too, am a worshipper of the God of Israel. It had been almost 3 years since the last rains. This dry spell is miserable, Ahaziah complained. Nothing's any fun anymore, and when we leave the palace, people look at us as if it's our fault or something. My father says that people get angry and always blame their leaders, whether it's their fault or not, Jedediah replied. That makes it even less fun to be the crown prince, Ahaziah pouted. It's bad enough in good times. What do you mean? Being the prince can't be that bad. You're given everything you ever want. Your life is probably the best of anyone in the country. Yeah, in the daytime. At night I lay there and think about things we learned in our history class. You mean you were listening? Jedediah teased. Ahaziah frowned at him but continued. Yeah, how often does the crown prince actually become the king in this country? In some countries, families rule for a long way, but not in Israel. Look at our recent history. Grandfather Omri was king for 12 years, and he did okay, but before him Zimri was king for only 7 days or so, and before that Elah was the king. Zimri didn't die of old age, and neither did Elah. Baasha ruled 24 years, but only because he killed the people who tried to assassinate him. Nadab was only king for 2 years. Nobody in their right mind would want to be the crown prince in this country if they thought about it or studied our history. Jedediah thought a moment, then nodded with a serious expression on his face. Yes, it is a little scary. Why do you think it is that kings of Israel rarely die of old age? I mean, King David and King Solomon all had long lives. It appears as if history is telling us that worshipping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob made kings a little safer and helped them live a lot longer than those who worship Baal. Ahaziah raised an eyebrow. You're sounding a little treasonous. No, just being observant, Jedediah said with a shrug. It seems that studying history has no other use than to help us figure out what previous kings did right or wrong so that we can know how to make the best choices and decisions. Snorted Ahaziah, then sat down thoughtfully. Anyway, it's just an idea, Jedediah said. He felt his jaw tighten, and the same little spot that twitched in his father's cheek when he was nervous now started twitching in the boy's face. The guardians moved in closer. Jedediah was becoming anxious. Had he said too much? Shaking off his own dark thoughts, Ahaziah stood. Well, enough thinking about this depressing stuff. Let's go do something. What if we ride out and look for Elijah? Can you imagine how pleased my father would be if the two of us were able to find him? Jedediah laughed. Perhaps shocked would be the word. Hey, I'm a good hunter, Ahaziah protested. Yeah, with a retinue of beaters and people to finish killing the beast for you and dragging it back to the palace and so forth. You don't think I could find him? Ahaziah demanded. Sounds like a challenge to me. Let's go prophet hunting. Oh, it's too hot. There's got to be something else to do around here, Jedediah protested. Nah, let's go prophet hunting. That could be fun. If you were the prophet, where would you hide? Jedediah looked around. What should he say? If he was a prophet, the caves in the Judean hills would be a great place to disappear into. He could hardly mention that, especially knowing that people were hiding there. And he for sure was not going to help Ahaziah search for Elijah. Well, he said, stalling. Hiding in a small village would be a bad idea because everyone knows everyone. And while there are a few people who will keep their mouth shut or protect you, probably it's unrealistic to count on everyone in an entire village. So if I were a prophet and I were looking for a place to hide, I would choose a large city and wear a disguise. People there are more used to seeing others they don't recognize, and with any luck no one would pay any attention to me, particularly if I hid alone and without other friends or family."
"Great idea," Ahaziah replied. "It just so happens that we live in such a city."
"Well, if we're going out, we need to take some guards with us." Life was never safe, but especially now with all the tensions caused by the drought and shortage of food.
"No problem. I'll get us some guards. Let's go prophet hunting."
Where would you start?" Jedediah stalled some more. "Samaria is huge now. Your father has built it into one of the most awesome capitals in this part of the world."
"I would start in the northern quarter. It's as good a place as any other. We can work ourselves systematically through the city for a few days. Besides that, there may be all kinds of other interesting things out there."
Jedediah reluctantly agreed. The city of Samaria was filled with interesting things, many of which his father had warned him against.
"The marketplace is the most fun," Ahaziah continued. "Traders from all over the world come through here. It's interesting to wander through there, looking at all the little stalls filled with rich fabrics and jewels and spices from other lands, and the fruit."
"It's not as interesting as it used to be," Jedediah pointed out. "There's little if any fruit in the market now, and the prices are high. The farmers are already selling their cattle and slaughtering them for meat because people are so hungry."
"High prices aren't a problem."
"Not for us, but for the people in the city they are. And the city people are hungry because the farmers aren't bringing in the fruit and grain they used to. There's very little to eat in the market, and consequently my father says there are fewer traders coming to Samaria from other countries. They're taking their goods to more prosperous nations where they can get better prices for them. Here in Samaria, people are hungry, and any money they do have is going to go for something to feed their families."
"Elijah has ruined our lives here in Samaria," Ahaziah complained. "Nothing is as it used to be since he came through here with his horrible curse."
Jedediah sighed. It was true. Nothing had been the same since then. He wondered if people had returned to worshiping the God of Israel, and if that would change anything. The boy's father had read him some of the promises that the God of Israel had made to his people way back through Moses. Would all of those promises of great blessing still apply if God's people were to worship him again? He glanced at Ahaziah. No, this was not a good day to suggest that idea. But maybe someday.
"Forget the prophet hunting," he said finally. "Let's go play that Egyptian game that we got. I think I figured out a tactic that will beat you so severely you'll never want to play it with me again." "You think you can beat me at that game?" Ahaziah countered. "I'd like to see that."
Jedediah grinned at him.
"You ought to let me win sometimes," the king's son complained. "I am a prince, you know."
His friend laughed. "When you're the king and can have me executed for beating you at games, I'll start letting you win once in a while." Both boys laughed.
"Yeah, you big talker," Ahaziah said. "When I'm king, you're going to let me win all the time, and you know it."
Jedediah hoped that his friend Ahaziah would someday become king. But Ahaziah was right. It was scary to think of his future here in the land of Israel.
This broadcast has come from the book Exile of the Chosen by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.